Israel Keyes. He was a predator hiding in plain sight, a killer with no pattern, boundaries, and very little remorse. He moved swiftly and silently across the country, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives. And his victims, who were chosen at random, were simply ordinary people who were caught in the web of his meticulously planned horrors. From Alaska all the way down to Vermont, he secretly buried his kill kits in remote and desolate locations, only to return years later to carry out his vicious and evil plans. And when he did strike with chaos and fear, he thrived from it. Not only once, but a second time too, when, even after being caught, he would manipulate investigators with his chilling confessions. But how precisely did Israel Keyes get away with his twisted crimes for so long? What exactly were his motives? And will we ever know the full scope of his murderous actions? I have to warn you folks that today's case is not for the faint of heart, and the genuinely unfathomable senselessness of this evil man's actions will leave you just as mad as confused. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening folks, and welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime. Today we're continuing from our story about Samantha Koenig to look at the more elaborate case of Israel Keyes. By the way, there's going to be less of me in this video today because I'm halfway between countries, so instead I'm going to use just my microphone. Saying that is not going to stop me from making more videos for you folks, so let's go. I post true crime, strange and dark stories here on a weekly basis, so if you want to support the channel, please do consider subscribing. And so with that said, please grab yourself a coffee, pull up a seat, and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Israel Keyes. Welcome back folks. In today's story, we begin in a small town found in one of America's most northeastern states. And of course, I'm talking about Essex in Vermont. Now I do have to say, but Essex seems to blend rural charm with modern convenience quite perfectly. And with a population of only 22,000 residents, it is small enough to know the area well without feeling too boring. Being just a stone's throw away from Burlington, Essex is Vermont's second largest municipality. But don't be fooled by its proximity to the city, as this place really does have its own unique vibe. It is home to the Champlain Valley Exposition, which hosts everything from fairs right through to concerts. You can also find the Essex Experience here, which is a quirky mix of shopping, dining, and cultural experiences. And after checking the old Google Maps, there does seem to be plenty of good options for coffee too. But if outdoor escapades are more your style, well, you're in luck here too. Almost 600 acres of natural beauty await you, with thanks to the Indian Brooktown Conservation Area and Saxon Hill's many trails. Now, historically, Essex dates all the way back to the New Hampshire land grants in 1763, and since then, it has grown from a humble settlement into a thriving community. So, whether you're wandering through the charming Harriet Farnsworth Powell Museum, or simply grabbing cider donuts at one of the town's famous orchards, Essex has something for everyone. However, sadly, the same could not be said on the morning of June the 9th, 2011. This quiet town was shaken when the sudden disappearance of a couple would sadly transform into a story nothing short of a horror movie. That was the day that Bill Currier, aged 49, and his wife, Lorraine Currier, aged 55, both failed to make it to work. You see, Bill and Lorraine were a reliable couple. They had their lives together and were well integrated into the local community. So, when they suddenly fell silent, that was sure to ring a few alarm bells. As the hours passed by without any sign of them, friends and family both grew concerned. And so that is when colleagues decided to contact the authorities to try and find out what had happened. When officers arrived at the Currier residence, they were immediately struck with worry, with multiple clues suggesting something terrible had happened. For one, the garage door had been left wide open, completely vulnerable to thieves and robbery. Now, this wouldn't be a problem if they were home or out in the front yard, but you see, there was no sign of the couple whatsoever, and upon closer inspection, officers realized that the home showed various signs of a violent struggle. Items were scattered inside, and there were bloodstains throughout the property. And, in addition to this, the phone line had been deliberately cut. The discovery of zip-tie packaging and the absence of their car would add to the growing suspicion that maybe they had been abducted. And as investigators pieced together all of the clues left behind, a chilling realization began to set in. This was no ordinary disappearance. It looks like the Curriers had been targeted in what appeared to be a planned and brutal crime. However, despite the mounting clues, there were very few leads alluding to where they had been taken to or who could have committed such a terrible act. There were other questions too. Why would they target the Curriers in the first place? I mean, these two were just a sweet-wise couple, and who could possibly want them dead? In order to answer those two questions, I'm going to answer a couple others first. That being, who were Bill and Lorraine Currier, and who could possibly want them dead? Beginning with Bill, William Bill Scott Currier was born and raised in the northeastern United States, spending much of his early life in Vermont. Growing up in a modest household, he developed a strong sense of responsibility and independence from a very young age. He was known as a quiet and thoughtful individual, someone who preferred to listen rather than dominate conversations. These kinds of traits would follow him into adulthood and shaped his approach to personal relationships and his own professional life. In short, Bill was a very hard worker, always committed to his tasks and well known for his reliability. It was after completing his education that he started to work in a series of jobs that reflected his dedication not only to helping others, but also maintaining a steady career path. And that is how he would eventually find his own calling in healthcare support services, working as a night shift caretaker for the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of Vermont. His role required him to manage vital tasks behind the scenes, ensuring that the department would run smoothly even during off hours. Over the years, Bill earned the trust and respect of all of those around him, both for his work ethic and his own humble approach to life. They say that age can either harden a man or turn him into a compassionate and gentle leader. And Bill, he was certainly the latter. During his own time in Vermont, he met his future wife, Lorraine, and although the details about how they first crossed paths are not widely documented, their relationship really did blossom over the years, leading to a long-lasting marriage filled with mutual respect, companionship, and a love for spending time in the peace of Vermont's natural surroundings. Lorraine Simone Currier was born on August 11, 1955, and she too grew up in Vermont. She was known for her kind and caring nature, and her life was marked by her deep commitment to family and friends. She worked at Fletcher Allen Healthcare, where she held a job in the financial services department. Her colleagues described her as a warm and compassionate person, one who was always willing to lend a hand and support others. Lorraine's background was actually quite similar to Bill's in the same regard that she came from a humble upbringing, valuing hard work, integrity, and life's many simple pleasures. Outside of work, she enjoyed spending time with Bill, particularly in outdoor activities such as hiking and exploring their home state's amazing countryside. Their shared love for nature and their low-key, contented lifestyle defined their relationship, making their bond an integral part of both of their lives. Bill and Lorraine built a quiet, comfortable life here in Essex, where they were well regarded by friends, family, and neighbours. Hardly a couple that others would see as a threat or even a nuisance. So that bears a couple key questions. Why were they targeted for a brutal attack and kidnapping? And where exactly were they now? The official search for both Bill and Lorraine was very extensive, but sadly unsuccessful. Search parties for the couple began on June 9, 2011, with investigations spanning both far and wide. And although the initial search focused on their home in Essex, there were very few clues as to where they had been taken. Of course, this left investigators with more questions than answers, and as days turned into weeks and eventually months, the investigation broadened. Local law enforcement, the FBI, and volunteers from the community all combed through possible locations. They canvassed the area, including nearby valleys, mountains, and woodlands, and all the way back to the urban landscape. Within the towns and cities, officers reviewed as much surveillance footage as they could get their hands on, but sadly, this too yielded little success. And with no substantial evidence leading to their whereabouts, over time, the case went cold. It wasn't until almost 1 year later, in March of 2012, that something very peculiar happened. That is when a man named Israel Keyes was arrested for the kidnap and murder of Samantha Koenig, a young woman who was recently murdered in Anchorage, Alaska. And little did officers know that her death would begin to unravel the mystery behind Bill's and Lorraine's disappearances. Now, quite obviously, it is routine work for police officers to determine if a murderer had operated in a single incident, or if perhaps he had murdered more than the one person he was currently being detained for. And no surprise, it was during his interrogation with police officers that Israel would eventually confess to murdering the unfortunate couple. And the longer he talked, investigators became convinced he was telling the truth, as he was starting to provide details that only their killer would have known. This included information about how he had abducted Bill and Lorraine, how he managed to murder them, and where he disposed of their bodies. To be more specific with you, it was in an abandoned farmhouse in Essex.
So what happened after you entered the house?
Oh, I just told them right away what was going on.
Were they cooperative at first, at least?
Yeah. Pretty shocked.
I'm sure.
People never expected stuff to happen to them.
Do you remember what you told them?
I just, it's like a blitz attack. You just make sure they know right away who's in charge and immediately tie them up, tell them what the rules are, that there's no talking unless I talk to them. They don't move unless I tell them to move, and did their hands behind their back and had them, pulled everything off the bed and got their hands and their feet together with cable ties and then just started talking, like asking them one question after the other.
So they you don't have to tell them, but they know they're being robbed. That's what they think is happening. They're being robbed.
Well, they kept trying to ask me. I didn't tell them what was happening. They kept trying to ask me what was going on, and I never answered them. It's just have to keep telling them to shut up and listen to me.
So, what about the motive for these brutal actions? Well, according to Israel, it was actually quite simple. It was simply because they were home. There was no rhyme or reason to his murders whatsoever. He simply wanted to kill for the thrill. The farmhouse in which he entombed their bodies had sadly been demolished shortly after, meaning that, despite extensive searches of the area, no trace of the Curriers has ever been found. Personally, I have no idea how you demolish a house without finding two bodies amongst the rubble. I mean, take the case of Joshua Maddox, for example. After missing for several years, he was found in the chimney of a cabin that was currently being torn down. The construction workers there were smart enough to identify him. So, how would you get by not identifying two grown adult bodies? Anyway, relative negligence aside, the lack of their discovery has left both of their families without closure through a proper burial. Now, the deeply alarming reality of all of this is that Israel actually murdered many more people outside of Samantha, Bill, and Lorraine. In fact, he would go on to admit to murdering several other people from many states including New York, Washington, Vermont, and more. His confessions spanned 11 lives across the country, but investigators believe that this number could actually be far, far higher. That is because Israel seemed intentionally vague around the details, likely because he relished being in control, and sadly, this left many cases unsolved. At least to begin with. For one, Israel spoke about murdering a young woman on the East Coast in the early 2000s. He claims that he disposed of her body in upstate New York, though sadly, her identity still remains unknown. He also hinted at killing another couple in Washington years before murdering Bill and Lorraine, where he then disposed of their bodies in a remote location. Unfortunately, Israel was very smart in his methodology. He had no consistent victim profile, selecting his targets at random in order to avoid being lured or detected by the authorities. He would also travel both far and wide across the country, planning his murders well in advance to avoid the mistakes commonly made over short distances and time. To help himself, he would create and then bury his so-called murder kits all over the country, with these kits containing weapons, money, and several murder supplies. And all of these were stashed underground in various states, where they would wait for him until he was ready to strike again. But surprisingly, murder was not his only crime. In fact, he also admitted to dabbling in bank robberies and even arson. He would often steal money to help fund his travels and supplies. And not only would this help him avoid detection, but it was technically free too. Following his sick confessions, the FBI would launch a nationwide effort to locate his hidden kits. Throughout this time frame, Israel would coyly provide scant details as to where they could find them, leading to several successful recoveries, but also many unfortunate dead ends. One of these kits would be found in the Adirondack Mountains in New York, while another was discovered in Alaska, and with some of these kits dating back several years, it was confirmed that this was no spur-of-the-moment fantasy either. Throughout the interrogations, Israel remained cold and detached, refusing to provide full details about any of his criminal activities, which of course left law enforcement and the public wondering about the true extent of his horrific actions. It is very evident that Israel loved to be in control of the situation, and with him teasing officers a little too much and refusing to cooperate fully, many of these kits were never found. In fact, to this very day, several are still believed to be out there, just waiting to be discovered. Now, before we talk about the individual stories of all of his other victims, let's first talk about what happened during Israel's trial, as I think that best sets the tone for the rest of this video moving forward. So, moving into legal proceedings, Israel would maintain his chilling and detached demeanor throughout all of these appearances, often smiling or appearing relaxed as the charges against him were read. While prosecutors were preparing for a high-profile trial that would link him to multiple murders, Israel seemed to be more interested in controlling the narrative instead. He would sporadically cooperate with investigators, providing limited information about his other victims, while also withholding many vital details. And although he provided some information, including how and vaguely where he murdered some of his other victims, he would deliberately withhold the identities and specific addresses. Now, undoubtedly, this left officers horrendously frustrated, but maybe that is precisely what he wanted after all. It is very clear that Israel wanted as much attention as possible. He would even demand that the death penalty be placed upon him, stating that he wanted a swift execution rather than enduring a lengthy trial. And in his rather typically controlling fashion, he refused to let the judicial system have any power over his fate. And that's because, on the morning of December 2nd, 2012, Israel Keyes was found dead in his jail cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. Even in death, he wanted to go out on his own terms, ending his life with a hidden razor blade, before then wrapping a bedsheet around his neck. Prison guards would find a suicide note beside him, filled with dark and cryptic writings, but sadly, it contained no additional details about his crimes or his victims. Israel's death marked a morbid end to a lifetime of calculated cruelty, one which left behind more questions than answers. The FBI and law enforcement agencies across the country were furious by the news, as now they were left to answer many puzzles with no puzzle master. Now, personally, I do wonder if maybe this was Israel's plan all along. By taking his secrets to the grave, not only would Israel immortalize himself with curiosity, but he would also deny the families and friends of the victims the opportunity to see him face justice. His death would unfortunately close off several murders, which are now expected to never be solved. Not only that, but the identities of some of his victims may remain a mystery forever. However, Israel was not completely silent about these victims, and his vagueness would cast a glimmer of light on numerous unsolved cases, ones that eerily aligned with his movements across the country and his brutal methods. And so, this is where we will look at several unsolved stories, which are all earmarked to be the work of Israel Keyes. It is important for us to honor and respect those who have passed away without closure. And yes, sadly, these may not be the most detailed of stories. However, they still represent a human who has died too soon. So, with that said, let us dive into several unsolved disappearances and review why law enforcement believes them to be made by Israel's hands. Turning all the way back to the year 1996, Julie Marie Harris was a bright and ambitious 13-year-old girl from Colville, Washington. It was on that year, on March the 2nd, that she disappeared while waiting for a ride to a local church. Now, despite her young age and also being a double amputee, Julie was in fact a Special Olympic skiing medalist. Her condition meant that, unfortunately, she had lost both of her feet, therefore requiring prosthetic feet to get around. And tragically, around 1 month after vanishing, those prosthetic feet were discovered near the Colville River. Despite law enforcement's best efforts to find out what had happened to her, they unfortunately had no idea. In fact, they couldn't even tell if she'd been murdered or if this were an accident. Her case would go almost entirely silent after that, until 1 year later, her remains were found on April the 26th, 1997. In a wooded area just a few miles away from her home. Despite the discovery, the cause of her death was never determined. It is worth noting that Israel Keyes lived in the area at the exact same time, when he was only 18 years old. And although he was questioned about the disappearance after his arrest in 2012, he would neither confirm nor deny any involvement in her tragic fate. So, did he murder Julie Harris? Well, sadly, we will likely never find out. Our next potential victim is Cassandra Emerson. Cassandra, or Cassie for short, was a 12-year-old girl from the same Colville area, and this was not your typical disappearance either. Cassandra was reported missing after the burned remains of her own mother, 29-year-old Marlene K. Emerson, was tragically found in their trailer home on June the 27th, 1997. Much like Julie, Cassandra's case would go silent over time, until the following year, her remains were discovered about 13 miles away from her home. Her death was shrouded in mystery too, with no definitive link to her killer. However, while in custody, Israel would actually admit that his first act of arson did indeed involve a trailer in Colville, hinting at a possible connection between him, Cassandra, and Marlene. Although the authorities do suspect that he could be linked to the deaths of all 3 women, he never provided any clear or definitive answers, leaving these cases wide open to interpretation. As a result, their families are still left without the closure that they so desperately look for, and sadly, I don't think they will ever find that answer. I hope they have all found peace through the years. Keeping ourselves within the borders of Washington, Israel did in fact confess to murdering at least 5 in this state. One of those he confessed to murdering is believed to have been buried or submerged in a lake near Near Bay between July and October 2001. Although one body had already been recovered from the lake in that time frame, it was ruled to be an accidental death, therefore leaving the case unresolved. He would also admit to the double homicide of a young couple between 2001 and 2005. Detailing how he beat the man to death before then going on to strangle his partner. He then buried both in a remote location still unknown to this day. Between the years 2005 and 2006, Israel claimed to have killed 2 more victims, with one body allegedly being dumped in Lake Crescent, Washington, and the other still unknown to this day. And sadly, despite these confessions, both of those cases are still unsolved. Moving south and over to the state of Florida, Israel is also considered to potentially be the dark mastermind behind a series of tragic events in the year 2007. Curiously, no one has ever found out who the so-called Boca Killer is, who is believed to have been involved in 3 devastating crimes connected to the town center in Boca Raton, Florida. The Boca Killer's first victim was Randy Ann Mallet Scorenberg, a beloved 52-year-old woman who was abducted from the mall's parking lot on March the 23rd, 2007. Sadly, within an hour of being abducted, she was dead. Her body was found at another location with with 2 gunshots. The second crime, which occurred on August the 7th, 2007, involved the kidnapping of a mother and her young toddler son from the very same parking lot. Although the assailant was masked, he was described as tall, athletic, and had long hair. And quite curiously, these details closely matched Israel's own description, leading officers to believe that it may have been him. Now, after forcing the woman to withdraw money from an ATM, the assailant then released both the woman and her child unharmed. Her bravery in recounting the incident to the police provided crucial information, though the trauma of the entire situation clearly had a profound impact on her moving forward. The third and final crime in this tragic series was not so lucky, and that was the heartbreaking murder of Nancy Bocciccio and her 7-year-old daughter, Joey Bocciccio Hauser. On December the 12th, 2007, both of them were found shot in the very same parking lot. The shocking loss of a mother and her child sent ripples of grief throughout the community, leaving family and friends to mourn their passing in a senseless act of violence. Authorities also believe that Israel may have actually been involved in the disappearance of 48-year-old Delba Feldman, a woman who, at the time, was facing difficult circumstances in her life. Deborah was last seen on April the 8th, 2009, at her apartment in Hackensack, New Jersey. Like many, she was a mother and a friend who struggled with personal challenges, but remained loved by those who knew her. Tragically, she vanished without a trace, and her body has never been recovered. But the reason why officers believe that Israel may have been involved in her disappearance is because, in the wake of his arrest, federal agents discovered that he had frequently searched for Deborah's missing persons case on his computer shortly before being detained. In addition to this, when shown her photo in the interrogation room, Israel paused before hesitantly saying, "I don't want to talk about her yet." Although he never provided a direct confession, the authorities do suspect that he may have buried her near Tupper Lake, which is found in New York State. Deborah's family continues to seek answers, remembering her for the life that she lived, and holding on to hope that they will one day find closure. To add to the growing list of probable names, James Lamar Tidwell Jr., also known as Jimmy, was a 58-year-old electrician from Mount Enterprise, Texas. Sadly, Jimmy also disappeared under very mysterious circumstances. It was on the morning of February the 15th, 2012, that he would vanish after completing a night shift. Jimmy was known as a hard-working and reliable man, one who took pride in his work and had many close ties within his community. So, when he suddenly disappeared one morning, his family, friends, and colleagues were all deeply concerned. This is where the story gets a little bit strange, but authorities would later link Jimmy's case to a bank robbery that took place the following day on February the 16th, 2012 in Azle, Texas. The suspect, who is believed to be Israel Keys, was seen wearing a white hard hat that was very similar to the one Jimmy used for work. The dark-haired wig the robber wore bore a striking resemblance to Jimmy's own hair. It was only during his interrogation that Israel made a chilling statement when asked about the wig, claiming that apparently it was not synthetic, but actually real human hair. When pressed about where he obtained the hair, he cryptically responded with, "You don't have to buy real hair to get real hair." Although he refused to elaborate any further, it is really gross stuff when you connect the dots and think about it. Although Jimmy's body has never been found, and the full truth still remains unclear to this day, his loved ones continue to honor his memory and hold on to hope that they will one day find closure. Jimmy is remembered for his dedication, kind heart, and positive impact on those around him. I would like to conclude our list by reminding us that, although each story has been small, it does not negate the significance of the person behind them. Behind each story is a human who has disappeared or died, and behind that human is a grieving family, dozens of friends, and an entire community left in the dark. Many of these cases still remain unsolved, but investigators do continue to pursue every lead and any possible connection to Israel Keys. Samantha Koenig, Bill and Lorraine Currier, and the many other victims of Israel are all remembered for the love, joy, and strength they brought into the world. And sadly, each and every one of them was cruelly taken long before their time. I hope that all of the families involved will one day find the peace and the closure they deserve. And with that said, I think I'm going to end this video here today, folks. However, before I go, I do have one personal question for you. Not so much on Israel Keys himself, but I know this case has been quite extensively covered on YouTube and on TV. Do you mind that with me? Do you like me to cover more notorious cases, or cases that are barely known? Please share your thoughts in the comments section down below. By the way, if you want to support me in the channel, please check out my Patreon here, or alternatively, check me out on social media here, most notably my Instagram. If you do sign up to my Patreon, you'll get early access to my videos and extra content as well. Mostly just small personal videos about my move and what else is going on. Anyway, I've got some packing to do, so I'm gonna go do that now. But before I go, I'd love to say thank you so much for watching today, and I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you again very soon for another video. Until that moment arrives though, remember to look after yourself, look after each other, and as always, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.